Welcome back to the channel, where the darkest mysteries, terrifying encounters, and unexplained horrors come to life. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chilling story. We upload true horror stories, creepy encounters, wilderness mysteries, paranormal experiences, and the kind of tales that stay with you long after the video ends. Tonight's story is one that has left countless people disturbed, confused, and searching for answers. What began as an ordinary day quickly turned into a nightmare that still can't be fully explained. As the events unfold, you'll discover why some witnesses refuse to speak about what they saw, and why others wish they had never gone looking for the truth. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a story that may make you think twice the next time you're alone in the dark. And remember, some stories are meant to be told. Others are meant to stay buried. Let's begin. In the autumn of 1963, a damaged audio recording was recovered from a remote section of the Appalachian wilderness. It was found partially buried beneath layers of fallen leaves, several miles from the nearest marked trail. There were no identifying markers nearby, no equipment, no signs of a campsite, no indication of how it came to be there. The tape itself had deteriorated over time. Sections were warped. Others were erased entirely. What remained was fragmented, unstable, and difficult to explain. What you are about to hear is not the original recording in its raw form. It has been processed using standard archival recovery methods, cleaned, stabilized, and reconstructed where possible. No attempt has been made to alter its content. The following audio is presented as evidence. The recording begins without warning. At approximately 3 seconds in, a voice becomes detectable. Female. Low volume. Whispering. The tone suggests controlled fear. An effort to remain quiet, possibly to avoid being heard. Audio enhancement reveals a repeated phrase, consistent across multiple passes of the tape. A few seconds later, a second voice enters the recording. Higher pitch. Breathing irregular. Signs of distress are evident. The second subject repeats a specific observation, one that investigators later noted as unusual. Shortly after the environmental audio shifts, the wind, which had been constant, drops abruptly to near silence. Yet movement continues. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Deliberate. The spacing suggests bipedal motion. Wildlife experts consulted during early analysis were unable to match the pattern to any known animal native to the Appalachian region. Moments later, a distant sound is captured on the recording. Its source remains unidentified. It does not align with documented vocalizations of regional wildlife. Immediately after this, the recording becomes unstable. Background noise collapses into silence. Then an impact. From that point forward, the audio degrades rapidly. What remains is mechanical distortion, scattered interference, and what appears to be uncontrolled movement near the recording device. No further intelligible speech can be confirmed. Approximately 20 seconds after the impact, the tape stops. No trace of the individuals heard in this recording was ever recovered. The only evidence that remained was this. In the fall of 1963, 2 sisters entered the Appalachian wilderness and never came back. Their names were Clara and Mabel. They were born and raised in a small rural community along the edges of the Appalachian region, an area defined by dense forests, long winters, and a way of life shaped by isolation. Records from that time are limited, but local accounts describe the sisters as familiar faces, quiet, self-reliant, and deeply accustomed to the land around them. Clara, the older of the two, was known for her composure. She kept notes, small observations about weather patterns, trail conditions, and seasonal changes. What remains of her writing suggests a methodical mind. Careful. Structured. Someone who paid attention to details others might overlook. Mabel, younger by several years, is described differently. Where Clara documented, Mabel felt. Accounts from neighbors and relatives describe her as perceptive, sometimes unusually so. She was said to notice subtle shifts in her surroundings, changes in sound, in atmosphere, in mood. While these descriptions are anecdotal, they appear consistently across multiple recollections. Together, the sisters were considered capable in the outdoors. They had experience navigating wooded terrain. Hunting was not unfamiliar to them. nor was the process of setting up temporary camps, managing supplies, or reading natural markers within the forest. This was not their first time entering the wilderness, which makes what happened more difficult to explain. According to the limited records available, Clara and Mabel left their home in early October of 1963. The stated purpose of their trip was routine, traveling into the forested region for a short hunting excursion. Weather conditions at the time were stable. There were no reported storms. No warnings issued. They were expected to return within a matter of days. They didn't. When the sisters failed to come back, concern was not immediate. In communities like theirs, extended time in the wilderness was not uncommon. Days could pass without contact, sometimes longer. But as time stretched on, unease began to grow. A search effort was eventually organized. Local volunteers, a small number of officials, individuals familiar with the terrain. They followed known trails, checked common camp locations, surveyed nearby areas where the sisters were likely to have traveled. Nothing was found. No campsite, no equipment, no signs of struggle, no tracks that could be clearly identified. The official conclusion, at least initially, was simple. The sisters had become lost. Disorientation in dense woodland is a well-documented phenomenon. Even experienced individuals can lose their sense of direction under certain conditions, especially in environments where landmarks repeat and visibility is limited. That explanation was accepted for a time. But over the following days and then weeks, small details began to surface, details that did not fully align with the assumption of a simple navigational error. Clara's journal, recovered in fragments, pages torn, sections missing, the remaining entries incomplete. And then the audio recording, discovered separately, not near any identifiable trail, not near any known search area previously covered. Its location raised questions that were never formally answered. These were not the kinds of findings typically associated with someone who had simply lost their way. There was no gradual trail of evidence leading deeper into the forest. No indication of prolonged survival attempts. No clear sequence of movement. Instead, there were pieces, isolated, disconnected, as if whatever had happened had interrupted something abruptly. And perhaps more importantly, something else stood out. The tone of what was recovered. The journal entries that could be read did not describe confusion. They described awareness, observation, concern, and in the final fragments, something closer to fear. This distinction matters, because individuals who become lost often leave behind signs of disorientation, circling paths, erratic movement patterns, attempts to retrace steps. But what Clara documented suggested something different, a growing sense that they were not alone. There are no official records confirming what the sisters encountered in those woods. No verified reports. No formal conclusions beyond the initial assumption. But among those who participated in the search, and those who later reviewed what little evidence remained, a different possibility began to take shape. Quietly, unspoken in formal reports, but persistent, because what was recovered does not read like the account of two people who simply lost their way. It reads like something else entirely, something that began slowly, subtly, almost unnoticed at first, and then became impossible to ignore. But what was recovered suggests they were not alone. To understand what may have happened to Clara and Mabel, it is necessary to understand the place they entered. The Appalachian region stretches across a vast portion of the eastern United States, an ancient mountain range, older than most on Earth, shaped over millions of years by erosion and time. What remains today is not defined by towering peaks, but by dense, layered forests that seem to extend without end. In many areas, the tree canopy is so thick that sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor. Even during the day, visibility can be limited. Light filters through in narrow beams, leaving large sections of the terrain in a kind of permanent dimness. This has a measurable effect on perception. Depth becomes difficult to judge. Distance becomes unreliable. Shapes blur into one another. What appears close may not be. What seems still may be moving. For those unfamiliar with it, the environment can be disorienting. But even for those who are familiar, there are other factors. Sound behaves differently in dense woodland. Under certain conditions, Forests can produce what researchers refer to as acoustic shadows or natural sound dead zones, areas where ambient noise is dampened or absorbed by vegetation, terrain, and atmospheric conditions. In these spaces, the usual indicators of life, whine through leaves, insect activity, distant animal calls, can fade unexpectedly. The result is not simply quiet. It is absence. And that absence can be deeply unsettling. Because when the forest goes silent, it is often for a reason. The Appalachian wilderness is also defined by its scale. There are stretches of land where human presence is minimal or entirely absent. Miles of uninterrupted forest. Limited access points. Few marked trails. In the 1960s, this isolation was even more pronounced. Navigation relied heavily on familiarity with the terrain. And once that familiarity was disrupted, recovery became significantly more difficult. It is within this environment that Clara and Mabel traveled. A landscape that does not reveal itself easily. A landscape that, even in modern times, continues to challenge those who enter it. But beyond its physical characteristics, the region carries something else. A long history of storytelling. Not formal records, but accounts passed down over generations. Fragments of belief. Observations that were never fully explained, but repeated often enough to remain. These stories vary depending on location and community. Some describe sounds in the distance that do not match known animals. Others speak of movement between trees. Too fast to follow, too deliberate to dismiss. There are references to voices, heard when no one is present. Names called from deeper within the forest. Most of these accounts are not documented in official records. They exist in conversation, in memory, in cautionary warnings passed quietly from one person to another. There are stories older than the trails themselves. Stories that do not begin with clear origins, and do not end with clear explanations. Fragments remain. References to something that moves through the forest. Not as part of it, but alongside it. Something associated not with territory, but with presence, with feeling, with a kind of awareness that is difficult to define. Certain themes appear repeatedly. Hunger. Not in the ordinary sense, but something prolonged. Unnatural. Never satisfied. Cold. Not simply temperature, but a sudden drop. A shift in atmosphere. An absence of warmth where it should exist. And warnings. Simple, direct, often repeated. Don't follow. Don't answer. Don't listen. These fragments are not presented as fact. They are not supported by measurable data. But they persist. And in regions like the Appalachians, persistence matters. Because stories that endure over time, without resolution, without closure, tend to form around something, even if that something remains undefined. In documented cases of wilderness disorientation, individuals often report similar sensations before becoming lost. A feeling of being watched. A sense that the environment has changed, even when it appears the same. Unexplained sounds. Or the sudden absence of sound entirely. These experiences are sometimes attributed to psychological stress, fatigue, isolation, the human brain attempting to interpret unfamiliar conditions. But not all accounts fit neatly into that explanation. Some remain incomplete, unresolved. And it is within this context that the final fragments of Clara's journal begin to take on a different weight. Because what she describes does not begin with fear. Begins with observation, subtle changes, small details, the kind that might be dismissed if they occurred only once. But they didn't. They repeated. They built over time. And eventually they shifted from something uncertain into something undeniable. In the Appalachian region, there is no single term universally agreed upon to describe what these stories refer to. Different communities use different language, different interpretations. But there is one idea that appears across multiple accounts. Not a creature, not in the traditional sense, but something else. Something tied not to form but to condition, to a state of being. They don't call it a creature. They call it a hunger that walks. By all available accounts, the first day of the sisters' journey began normally. There was no indication, at least initially, that anything was out of place. Weather conditions across the region were stable that morning. Archival climate data from October of 1963 shows mild temperatures throughout much of the Appalachian Range, with low wind activity and clear visibility during the early hours of the day. For experienced outdoorsmen at the time, the conditions would have been considered favorable. The sisters departed shortly after sunrise. Based on the remaining journal fragments and reconstructed timelines from local interviews, they entered the forest carrying standard hunting equipment and enough provisions for a short trip. Nothing excessive, nothing unusual. And in the beginning there was no apparent sense of danger. The surviving notes from Clara describe familiar terrain. Narrow paths winding between dense pine and hardwood growth. Fallen leaves damp from overnight condensation. The distant sound of moving water somewhere deeper within the valley. Small observations. Ordinary observations. The kind people make when they believe they understand where they are. This matters because fear, when it eventually appears, does not emerge immediately. It arrives gradually, almost unnoticed. According to those who knew them, the relationship between the sisters was close but uneven in temperament. Clara approached situations practically, focused, controlled. Mabel, by comparison, appears to have been more reactive to her surroundings, more likely to comment on subtle changes in atmosphere or mood. The early portions of Clara's journal reflect this contrast. Some entries contain small details that appear almost playful in tone. References to Mabel complaining about steep inclines. Notes about the cold air settling earlier than expected beneath the tree cover. Passing remarks about who was carrying more equipment. Normal conversation. Normal movement. Nothing yet suggests panic. But there are indications that the environment itself began changing long before the sisters fully recognized it. One of the first documented irregularities appears several hours into their hike. Clara describes coming across a deer carcass partially concealed beneath brush near a clearing. No official photographs exist, but her written account is unusually specific. The animal appeared recently dead. There were no visible signs of predation. No tearing. No feeding marks. No evidence of scavenger activity. And perhaps most unusual, no insects. This detail appears more than once in the surviving fragments. No flies. No carrion beetles. Nothing. Under ordinary environmental conditions, decomposition begins attracting insect activity rapidly, especially in wooded regions rich in scavenger populations. The absence of any visible activity appears to have unsettled both sisters immediately. At first, Clara attempted to explain it rationally. Disease. Possible poisoning. Exposure. But the longer they remained near the carcass, the stranger the surrounding conditions appeared to become. The forest had gone quiet. Not gradually. Suddenly. No birds. No distant movement. No insects. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees. And then, even that began to fade. Researchers who study wilderness environments have documented similar phenomena in predator-rich areas. Natural silence can occur when nearby wildlife detects a threat. Animals stop vocalizing. Movement decreases. Entire sections of forest can become temporarily still. But according to Clara's notes, this silence felt different. Not reactive. Intentional. As if the forest itself was waiting. The sisters did not turn back. And that decision, in hindsight, may have marked the point where the tone of the journey began to change. Because shortly after leaving the clearing, they found something else. Footprints. At first, the impressions appeared difficult to identify due to the uneven terrain. The ground in that section of forest was soft from recent moisture, covered in layers of wet leaves and loose soil. But the deeper they followed the impressions, the clearer they became. The surviving journal fragments describe them as elongated, too narrow for the size suggested by their depth, spaced unnaturally far apart, and most concerning, pressed deeply into the ground, as though whatever created them carried extreme weight. One line from Clara's writing stands out in particular, not because of what she says, but because of how abruptly the tone changes. Until this point, her observations remain measured, practical, controlled. Then suddenly uncertainty enters the journal. The sentence is short, almost interrupted. Mabel says the tracks don't look right. Another fragment follows underneath. The soil around them is compressed too deeply. And then, further down the page, partially damaged by moisture, a final line remains visible. Why does it look like it sank into the ground? The wording is important. Because Mabel does not ask what made the tracks. She asks why they appear wrong, why they feel unnatural. As daylight continued fading beneath the dense canopy, the atmosphere surrounding the sisters appears to have shifted further. The surviving entries become shorter, more fragmented. Descriptions replace conversation. Movement replaces scenery. Repeated references begin appearing more frequently. Silence. Distance. The sensation of being observed. One entry describes the feeling of hearing movement behind them, only for nothing to be visible when they stopped walking. Another mentions the strange difficulty of determining direction beneath the trees. Areas of forest beginning to look identical. Landmarks becoming uncertain. And then, near the end of the remaining page, Clara writes a sentence that investigators later highlighted repeatedly during analysis. A sentence simple enough to appear insignificant at first glance, but in context deeply unsettling. The woods feel wrong. No further explanation follows. Only the unfinished edge of the torn page. And after that point, the journal entries begin changing completely. As the first day came to an end, the forest changed again. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in subtle ways that became increasingly difficult to ignore. By sunset, visibility beneath the trees had already begun collapsing into shadow. In heavily wooded sections of the Appalachian region, darkness arrives earlier than expected. Dense canopy cover blocks remaining light long before the sun fully disappears beyond the horizon. According to the surviving journal fragments, Clara and Mabel established camp near a small clearing bordered by thick pine growth on three sides. The location appears to have been chosen for practical reasons. Open enough for visibility, dry enough for a fire, elevated slightly above the surrounding terrain to avoid overnight moisture accumulation. At least initially, the atmosphere remained calm. Clara's notes describe routine activity: collecting firewood, checking supplies, preparing bedding near the fire. The kind of repetitive tasks that create a sense of normalcy in unfamiliar environments. And for a short time, that normalcy appears to have worked. The fire became their center point, their only reliable source of light. Beyond it, there was almost nothing visible. Only trees, only darkness. Researchers who study low-light wilderness environments often describe a psychological phenomenon associated with isolated forests at night. Human depth perception becomes unreliable in darkness interrupted by limited firelight. The brain struggles to distinguish fixed shapes from movement. Tree limbs appear to shift. Shadows seem to reposition themselves at the edge of vision. Under ordinary circumstances, experienced outdoorsmen learn to ignore these distortions. But the sisters' situation no longer appears to have been ordinary. As the night deepened, the remaining journal entries begin shortening significantly. Sentences become incomplete. Observations repeat. Certain details begin appearing again and again. Sound, or more specifically movement within sound. The first indication comes from a partially damaged line written near the edge of one surviving page. Something keeps moving beyond the trees. No conclusion follows. No attempt at explanation. Only the statement itself. Later entries suggest both sisters heard it. Soft movement circling beyond the firelight. Footsteps difficult to place precisely in direction. At times distant. At times closer. And always stopping whenever attention shifted toward them directly. This detail is important, because many naturally occurring sounds in forests follow recognizable patterns. Animal movement tends to continue unless interrupted. Branches break under weight. Leaves shift consistently beneath motion. But according to Clara's notes, these sounds behave differently. Measured. Controlled. As if whatever produced them was aware of being listened to. At approximately this point in the reconstructed timeline, another environmental shift appears to occur. The forest goes quiet again. Not gradually. Instantly. Completely. Wildlife noise disappears completely. No insects, no owls. No distant movement through brush. Only the sound of the campfire itself. Cracking wood. Popping embers. And somewhere beyond the darkness, occasional movement. Search analysts later noted that repeated references to silence appear throughout Clara's journal. More than fear itself, silence seems to have unsettled the sisters most strongly. Because silence in wilderness environments is rarely empty. It usually means something nearby has caused everything else to stop. One surviving fragment describes Mabel becoming increasingly uncomfortable after nightfall. Clara notes that her sister repeatedly believed she saw movement between the trees surrounding camp. At first, Clara appears skeptical. The journal reflects attempts to rationalize what they were experiencing. Wind movement, shifting shadows, exhaustion. But eventually her tone changes. One line appears underlined twice. I saw it too. Unfortunately, the section following this statement is torn away. No description remains of what exactly was seen. Only that something moved beyond the tree line briefly enough to avoid clear identification. And then another detail emerges. Perhaps the most disturbing of the night. According to the reconstructed sequence of events, both sisters heard what sounded like a voice somewhere beyond the campfire. Not loud, not shouted, whispered. The surviving note suggests the voice spoke only a single word. Mabel. Clara specifically records that she had not spoken. This matters because the journal entries immediately afterward become noticeably less structured. Handwriting pressure increases. Sentences become uneven. Certain words are scratched over repeatedly as though written under stress. Psychological studies involving wilderness isolation have documented auditory misinterpretation under conditions of fear and exhaustion. Wind patterns, distant wildlife, and environmental acoustics can occasionally resemble human speech to listeners already under stress. But again, certain details complicate that explanation. The sisters did not describe uncertainty about hearing something. They described certainty. And after the voice was heard, conditions around the camp appear to have shifted rapidly. The fire began weakening unexpectedly. Not from lack of fuel. Not from rainfall or strong wind. In fact, according to Clara's writing, the wind had stopped entirely. One surviving sentence describes the air as feeling still in the wrong way. No movement in the trees. No sound beyond the immediate crackling of the fire. Only darkness surrounding the clearing completely. Clara then notes another detail investigators would later revisit repeatedly. The sensation that something beyond the firelight was watching them. Not moving. Not approaching. Only waiting. The final surviving lines from that portion of the journal are brief. Scattered. Written unevenly across the page. Mabel won't sleep. Something keeps circling. And finally, when the fire gets lower, it comes closer. No additional entries appear for several hours after that point. Only darkness. Only silence. And somewhere beyond the edge of the campfire, something the sisters could not yet see clearly. Watching them from the trees, morning should have brought relief. Instead it brought silence. Not the ordinary quiet of deep woodland before sunrise. Not the temporary stillness caused by cold air settling through the trees. According to the surviving journal fragments, the silence the sisters experienced on the second day felt complete. Heavy. Unnatural. When Clara resumed writing sometime after dawn, the tone of her journal had changed noticeably from the previous entries. The humor was gone. The casual observations were gone. What remained was shorter. Focused almost entirely on the environment around them. One line appears near the top of the damaged page. No birds this morning. Beneath it, written separately, no sound at all. This detail appears repeatedly throughout the remaining fragments recovered from the site. Investigators later noted how often Clara returned to the subject of silence, as though she considered it more alarming than the movement they had heard during the night. Environmental researchers have long documented the importance of ambient sound in wilderness settings. In healthy forest ecosystems, background noise is constant. Insects, distant bird calls, small animal movement, shifting branches. These sounds create a continuous layer of environmental information. When that layer disappears entirely, people notice. Experienced hunters notice even faster. Because silence often signals the presence of a nearby predator. But according to Clara's writing, this did not feel like the presence of a normal predator. The sisters broke camp shortly after sunrise. Based on the reconstructed timeline, they appear to have made the decision quickly. There are no indications they intended to remain in the area longer than necessary. Several entries suggest Clara believed movement was safer than staying exposed in one location. At first, they attempted to retrace their original route. But almost immediately problems began appearing. Landmarks seemed unfamiliar. Tree formations appeared repetitive. Distances described in the journal no longer aligned with the terrain they should have been crossing. One surviving sentence simply reads, "We should have reached the creek already." There is no explanation afterward. Only a long scratch across the page where the pencil appears to have dragged suddenly sideways. Disorientation in dense forests is well documented, particularly in regions where terrain lacks visible landmarks. Studies involving wilderness survival show that individuals without reliable navigation points often begin unconsciously walking in circles. But again, Clara's journal suggests something different. Not confusion. Interruption. Repeated interruption. The sisters were no longer simply moving through the forest. They were reacting to it. Several hours into the morning, the journal references another discovery. This time, something far more disturbing than tracks or distant movement. The remains of an animal suspended from a tree. The species is never clearly identified in the surviving fragments due to damage within the journal pages, though descriptions suggest a deer or similarly sized animal native to the region. But what unsettled the sisters was not merely the carcass itself. It was the condition it had been left in. Clara notes that the body hung unnaturally high above the ground, well beyond what would normally be expected from natural predation or scavenger behavior. Portions of the remains appeared untouched while others showed signs of tearing inconsistent with known animal feeding patterns. Then there were the bones, scattered deliberately beneath the tree, not randomly arranged. The exact shapes described in the journal are incomplete due to missing pages, but investigators reviewing the fragments later referenced repeated geometric patterns surrounding the site. Lines, circles, symmetry, the kind of placement that suggests intention, human or otherwise. At this point in the recovered writings, Clara's skepticism appears to weaken significantly. One sentence is written more heavily than the others, as though pressed into the paper with unusual force. "This isn't an animal." No additional explanation follows the statement. But the next surviving line, believed to reflect Mabel's response, marks another escalation in the sisters' fear. "No, it's watching us." The wording is significant, because neither sister describes the feeling of being lost anymore. They describe being observed. This distinction becomes increasingly important as the second day progresses. After leaving the clearing, Clara's entries become fragmented again. The attempts at rational explanation begin fading from the entries completely, because by the second night approaching, the sisters no longer seemed to believe they were alone in those woods. They believed something had been following them for a very long time, and now it finally wanted to be seen. As daylight began fading on the second day, the nature of the sisters' fear appears to change completely. Until this point, Clara's journal reflects uncertainty, an ongoing attempt to interpret what they were experiencing through logic and observation. Strange tracks, unusual silence, movement between trees, the possibility of another person somewhere deeper in the forest. But after the sighting in the trees, the tone of the entries shifts noticeably. The practical explanations begin disappearing, and something older begins surfacing in their place. Throughout Appalachian history, isolated communities preserved countless oral traditions tied to the wilderness surrounding them. Many of these stories overlap with older Algonquian folklore originating farther north around the Great Lakes region and parts of Canada. Stories connected to winter starvation, isolation, and entities associated with insatiable hunger. Over time, interpretations changed. Details shifted from region to region, but certain themes remained remarkably consistent. A presence that imitates human behavior. A voice that does not belong where it is heard. Something that calls from the trees, attempting to draw people deeper into isolation. The exact origins of these legends are difficult to trace with precision. Historians and folklorists generally agree that stories associated with the Wendigo evolved across generations through a combination of spiritual belief, survival fears, and cautionary storytelling, connected to extreme wilderness conditions. But among nearly all versions of the legend, one characteristic appears repeatedly: mimicry. Not perfect imitation. Almost perfect. Close enough to create confusion. Close enough to make someone stop walking, or worse, answer back. According to the remaining journal fragments, this is precisely when the sisters' experiences became far more disturbing. The first references appear indirect. Clara notes hearing sounds behind them that resembled distant conversation. At first she believed the noises were echoes carrying through the trees, something not entirely uncommon in mountainous terrain where acoustics can distort direction and distance. But the sounds continued, and gradually they became recognizable. One entry describes hearing what sounded like their mother calling out from somewhere behind them, not shouting, speaking calmly, as if only a short distance away. This detail appears to have deeply unsettled both sisters for one critical reason. Their mother was nowhere near the forest. According to reconstructed timelines, she would have been nearly 30 miles away at the time. Clara initially attempts to explain the incident rationally within the journal. Auditory confusion caused by exhaustion, wind movement, stress responses, the human brain searching for familiarity under pressure. But later entries suggest the phenomenon intensified rapidly. The voices became clearer, closer, and increasingly impossible to dismiss. Psychologists studying wilderness isolation have documented cases where prolonged stress, fear, dehydration, and sensory deprivation contribute to auditory hallucinations. Under extreme conditions, individuals may misinterpret environmental sounds as speech or familiar voices. However, most documented cases occur during advanced stages of exhaustion or survival collapse. The sisters had not yet reached that point, which makes the timing of these experiences more difficult to explain. Several fragments recovered from Clara's journal suggest the voices began separating them psychologically long before physical separation occurred. At one point, Clara writes that she heard Mabel calling from somewhere off the trail ahead of her. But when she turned, Mabel was standing behind her. Another line follows beneath it. She heard me too. This pattern repeats across multiple entries. One sister hears the other from the wrong direction. Voices appearing farther away than they should. Sometimes closer. Sometimes directly behind them. Always where the other person was not. And according to the journal, the voices never sounded completely wrong. Only wrong enough. Folklorists studying wilderness legends throughout North America often point to this detail specifically. In many traditional accounts involving mimicking entities, the imitation is described as slightly imperfect. The voice resembles someone familiar, but lacks natural rhythm, emotion, or timing. Something recognizable filtered through something unfamiliar. As darkness approached once again beneath the trees, Clara's entries become increasingly fragmented. Sentences stop halfway through. Words repeat. One section contains the same warning written 3 times across the page. Stay where I can see you. The pressure of the handwriting becomes heavier afterward, as though written in haste. Then another sentence appears beneath it. Mabel answered from the wrong direction. No further explanation follows. By this stage, the reconstructed timeline suggests the sisters were moving continuously, no longer stopping except briefly to orient themselves. Clara's journal references repeated attempts to determine whether another person could have been following them through the forest. But several details contradicted that possibility. They never found clear tracks, never heard sustained movement, never saw anyone long enough to identify them. Only fragments, sounds, shapes between trees, and voices. Always the voices. One surviving journal page contains one of the clearest examples of the sisters' growing panic. The handwriting is uneven. Portions of the page are smeared as though exposed to moisture or written while moving. Mabel keeps hearing me call her. But I'm not speaking. Another line follows beneath it immediately. I hear her too. And then lower on the page, almost pressed through the paper itself. It wants us apart. This sentence marks a significant escalation in Clara's thinking, because until this point the journal reflects uncertainty about what they were experiencing. Now, for the first time, intention enters the narrative. Not random movement. Not coincidence. Purpose. The idea that whatever was surrounding them understood exactly what it was doing. As night approached, the forest conditions described in the journal became increasingly hostile. Temperatures dropped faster than expected beneath the canopy. Visibility narrowed rapidly between the trees. Several entries mention the sensation of movement pacing them somewhere beyond sight. Never rushing, never attacking, only following. One final fragment from this section survives almost completely intact. The writing is hurried, unsteady, but legible. Mabel, stay where I can see you. Then beneath it, written differently, almost jagged across the page, I didn't move. After that point, the journal pages become increasingly difficult to reconstruct, and the sisters' fear begins turning into something far worse than fear alone. Realization. By the second night, the sisters had stopped behaving like people on a hunting trip. They were no longer exploring, no longer navigating, no longer attempting to understand the forest around them. According to the final surviving journal fragments, they were trying to avoid something. And more importantly, they believed that something was getting closer. The transition appears gradual at first. Clara's writing becomes increasingly erratic as darkness approaches again beneath the canopy. References to direction disappear almost entirely from the journal. There are no more notes about landmarks, no attempts to map their movement, no mention of returning home, only observations connected to immediate survival, sound, distance, movement, and the growing certainty that whatever had been following them no longer cared whether it was noticed. By this point in the reconstructed timeline, the sisters appear to have abandoned the idea of maintaining a visible camp. No surviving entries mention building another fire. This detail is significant. Experienced outdoorsmen in cold wilderness conditions rarely avoid fire, unless they believe visibility creates greater danger than darkness itself. One fragmented sentence appears near the top of a damaged page. Too easy to see us. Nothing else follows. Researchers familiar with survival behavior often note that fear changes priorities rapidly. Warmth becomes secondary. Rest becomes secondary. The brain shifts entirely toward concealment and threat monitoring. And according to the surviving evidence, that is exactly what happened to Clara and Mabel. As night fully settled across the forest, visibility would have collapsed almost completely beneath the trees. In heavily wooded Appalachian terrain, moonlight often struggles to penetrate dense canopy cover. Without artificial light or fire, human depth perception becomes severely limited. Shapes lose definition. Distance disappears. The line between movement and shadow begins to blur. Several later journal entries suggest the sisters spent long periods sitting in complete darkness, listening, waiting, trying to determine where the sounds around them were coming from. At first, the noises remained distant. Slow movement through leaves, occasional branches bending under weight. But sometime deeper into the night, the sounds changed. The remaining journal fragments repeatedly describe breathing. Close breathing. Not imagined. Not uncertain. Close enough to hear clearly in the dark. One line appears scratched heavily across the page. It's behind us again. No punctuation. No explanation. Just the statement itself. Then another line beneath it. Too close. Psychological studies involving fear responses in isolated environments often describe heightened sensory awareness during periods of perceived danger. Small sounds become magnified. Breathing patterns become easier to detect. The brain begins searching constantly for movement. But Clara's writing suggests something more direct than heightened anxiety. The sisters did not believe they were imagining sounds. They believed something was physically circling them. One particularly damaged section of the journal references movement unlike anything described earlier in the story. Not footsteps. Dragging. Wet movement. Slow, uneven but deliberate. Unfortunately, portions of the page are missing, leaving only fragments of the description intact. Sounded wrong. Like it was hurt. No animal moves like that. Then nothing. Only torn paper. At some point during the night, the sisters appear to have made the decision to remain completely silent. Later entries contain almost no references to conversation between them. Communication becomes reduced to brief warnings. Single observations written quickly before movement resumes. And then the sighting occurs. Not another glimpse between trees. Not distant movement. A direct visual encounter. The surviving description is incomplete, but investigators reviewing the journal repeatedly highlighted the same details preserved across multiple damaged fragments. The figure stepped partially into view beyond the trees. Not fully exposed. Only enough to be seen clearly for a moment. And according to Clara's writing, the proportions were wrong. The arms appeared unusually long. The body thin to the point of appearing unnatural. Not starving. Elongated. As though stretched. One surviving line describes the way it stood as bending without moving. Another references difficulty determining exactly where its limbs began and ended against the darkness. But the most disturbing detail appears repeatedly across several separate fragments. The face, or more specifically the mouth. Clara never fully describes it directly. Instead, the journal focuses on reaction rather than appearance. Mabel started crying. I couldn't look at it for long. It kept smiling. This final line appears written twice. The second version darker, pressed heavily into the paper. Researchers examining folklore surrounding wilderness entities often note how witnesses struggle to describe facial details clearly under extreme fear conditions. Human memory under stress frequently records impressions rather than precise features. And impressions are exactly what dominate the remaining entries. Sunken eyes. A mouth too wide. Movement that appeared wrong even while standing still. Then comes one of the final intact statements believed to have been written before the journal deteriorates completely. The handwriting is unstable, almost trembling across the page. It smiled at me. No additional context follows the sentence. No explanation of what happened afterward. Only a series of incomplete marks trailing downward across the paper, as though the writing had been interrupted suddenly. What happened immediately after this sighting remains unclear. But one detail becomes increasingly evident from the remaining evidence. The sisters' fear had changed again. Earlier entries describe confusion, then concern, then panic. But by the second night, something else had entered the journal entirely. Acceptance. The growing realization that whatever was moving through those woods with them was no longer hiding. And perhaps worse, it no longer needed to. After the second sighting, the remaining evidence becomes increasingly fragmented. What survives from this point forward comes primarily from damaged journal pages, partial audio reconstruction, and the final moments recovered from the tape itself. And together they suggest the sisters stopped hiding. They started running. Exactly what triggered the chase remains unclear. There is no surviving entry describing a direct attack. No definitive moment where the figure suddenly rushed toward them from the darkness. In fact, the absence of immediate violence is one of the most disturbing elements preserved throughout the evidence. Because according to the reconstructed timeline, whatever had been following them did not behave like a normal predator. It did not charge. It did not pursue in straight lines. And it did not appear to fear being seen anymore. The final coherent journal fragments suggest Clara and Mabel became convinced sometime during the second night that remaining stationary was no longer possible. One torn section contains only 2 legible lines. It's getting closer. We can hear it breathing. After this point, the handwriting changes drastically. Sentences tilt unevenly across the page. Pencil pressure becomes inconsistent. Entire sections appear scratched out or interrupted abruptly as though written while moving. Then comes a phrase repeated several times throughout the damaged pages. Don't stop moving. This appears to have become Clara's primary focus. Movement, distance, escape. Psychologists studying survival behavior under extreme stress often note that once fear escalates beyond uncertainty into confirmed threat recognition, cognitive function narrows dramatically. Complex reasoning begins collapsing into immediate priorities. Run. Hide. Keep moving. The sisters' writings from this stage reflect exactly that progression. The environment around them also appears to have deteriorated further. Several surviving fragments describe increasing difficulty navigating the terrain in darkness. Dense undergrowth. Slippery ground. Fallen branches hidden beneath leaves. Visibility reduced to only a few feet between the trees. And throughout all of it, the sounds continued. Heavy movement somewhere behind them. Branches snapping. Not randomly. In sequence. Matching their direction. One section of the reconstructed audio contains rhythmic impacts consistent with rapid movement through wooded terrain. Investigators analyzing the tape noted overlapping sounds occurring at irregular distances from the microphone, as though movement surrounded the sisters rather than followed directly behind them. This detail appears repeatedly in Clara's final entries. It keeps getting ahead of us. Another line follows beneath it. We never hear it leave. This distinction becomes critical, because according to the journal, the figure was not chasing them in a way the sisters could understand. At times they heard movement behind them, then suddenly beside them, then ahead, always at impossible distances given the speed at which they themselves were moving. One partially recovered section of audio captures what analysts believe to be heavy breathing close to the microphone, accompanied by rapid movement through leaves and underbrush. In the background, wood fractures sharply, as though large branches are breaking under significant force. But there are no clear footsteps, only impacts, sudden, scattered, unpredictable, and somewhere within the distortion screaming. The remaining journal fragments become almost entirely unreadable after this point. Most pages are torn, smeared, or water damaged. But several short phrases remain visible. Mabel fell. Couldn't see where it went. It was beside us. Then another line, written darker than the rest. Not running. This phrase appears important enough that Clara underlined it repeatedly. Because what terrified the sisters most may not have been speed, but effortlessness. The impression that whatever moved through those woods did not need to chase them at all. One reconstructed sequence from the tape suggests a sudden interruption in movement, consistent with someone collapsing or stumbling. Audio analysts later noted sounds matching rapid impact against wet ground followed by heightened panic in the surviving voices. Immediately afterward, another phrase becomes audible through the distortion. Get up. Repeated several times. Urgent. Panicked. Then louder. Get up. Following this section, the audio deteriorates significantly. Wind interference spikes across the recording. Branches crack repeatedly nearby. One impact occurs extremely close to the microphone, too close to determine direction clearly. And then, according to the journal fragments recovered later, the sisters saw it again. Not distant this time. Not partially hidden. Close. Several surviving descriptions appear fragmented across different torn pages, but the details remain consistent. It moved between trees without sound. Not smoothly. Not naturally. At moments it appeared completely still. Then suddenly somewhere else. Closer. Witnesses experiencing traumatic events often report distorted perception during high adrenaline states. Time slows. Movement becomes difficult to track accurately. Distance collapses. Sudden appearances may result from the brain struggling to process fragmented visual information under stress. But Clara's writing suggests something more disturbing than confusion. The figure did not seem fast. It seemed absent between movements. One line remains particularly intact despite damage to the surrounding page. It doesn't run. Another follows beneath it. It just appears. By this stage, the sisters no longer seem to believe escape was possible through ordinary means. References to direction disappear completely. There is no mention of finding trails. No mention of returning home. Only movement through darkness. Only panic. And always the sense that something impossible was staying exactly close enough to keep them running. Never attacking directly. Never fully revealing itself. Only driving them deeper into the forest. Toward somewhere unknown. Or perhaps, toward somewhere chosen long before they ever entered those woods. What remains after this point is believed to be the final recording ever recovered from the sisters' expedition. Unlike the earlier sections of tape, which contain fragmented environmental sounds and partial speech patterns, the final sequence is different. Closer. More chaotic. And significantly more difficult to explain. The recovered audio begins abruptly in the middle of movement. Analysts reviewing the tape identified sustained microphone interference consistent with rapid motion through dense terrain. Branches strike the recording device repeatedly. Wind distortion overwhelms portions of the signal. At several points, breathing becomes so close to the microphone that individual inhalations can be isolated beneath the static. One important detail emerges almost immediately. At least one of the sisters appears injured. The exact nature of the injury is impossible to determine from surviving evidence, but movement patterns captured on the recording suggest instability, frequent stumbling, uneven pacing, and repeated interruptions in motion. The sisters are no longer moving together cleanly. One is slowing down, and panic is beginning to override coordination entirely. Psychological studies involving prolonged survival stress indicate that once exhaustion and fear combine with physical injury, perception begins deteriorating rapidly. Decision-making collapses. Individuals struggle distinguishing direction, distance, and source location of sound. But what occurs during the final recording appears to go beyond ordinary disorientation. Because by this stage, the voices surrounding the sisters no longer seem distinguishable from each other. Several portions of the recovered tape contain overlapping vocal patterns that analysts initially believed belonged only to Clara and Mabel. However, later enhancement revealed inconsistencies within those recordings. Timing mismatches, layered repetitions, moments where the same voice appears to originate from multiple directions almost simultaneously. One reconstructed section captures what investigators described as call and response confusion. A voice believed to belong to Clara calls out briefly through heavy breathing. Then seconds later, the same voice appears again, farther away, distorted, repeating nearly identical phrasing. Not perfectly, but close. Too close. This phenomenon repeats multiple times throughout the final minutes of tape recovery. Mabel's voice becomes audible near the microphone. Then moments later, somewhere deeper in the forest. Always slightly delayed. Always from the wrong direction. Folklore researchers examining traditional wilderness legends have often noted mimicry as one of the most persistent elements across oral accounts involving isolated forest encounters. The purpose of mimicry within these stories is rarely direct attack. It is confusion, separation, disorientation, drawing individuals farther away from safety by forcing them to question what they are hearing. And according to the reconstructed evidence, that is exactly what appears to happen during the final recording. The sisters stop trusting their own senses. One surviving journal fragment recovered separately from the tape contains only a single sentence written repeatedly across the page. That isn't her voice. The phrase appears 4 times before the page tears off completely. By now, the audio itself becomes increasingly unstable. The sounds of movement surrounding the sisters intensify. Branches break nearby at irregular intervals. At several moments, something large appears to move parallel to them through the trees without ever entering clear range of the microphone. And then the screaming begins. Not continuous. Sudden. Sharp bursts of panic immediately cut short. The exact source becomes difficult to identify due to overlapping distortion across the tape. But investigators reviewing the sequence later noted something deeply unsettling. The screams do not always sound separate from the mimicry. At points, the voices blend together. Human fear becoming almost indistinguishable from whatever is responding to it. One of the clearest surviving moments occurs approximately 4 minutes before the tape ends. The movement stops briefly. Heavy breathing dominates the recording. Then a phrase becomes audible through the static. Slow. Terrified. Exhausted. It's not chasing us. A pause follows. During enhancement analysis, faint movement can reportedly be heard circling somewhere beyond the microphone range during this silence. Then the sentence finishes. It's hurting us. This line would later become one of the most discussed portions of the entire recording, because it suggests a realization. The sisters no longer believed they were fleeing randomly through the forest. They believed they were being directed, controlled, moved intentionally toward a destination they could not see. What that destination was remains unknown. But immediately after this statement, the final collapse begins. The audio spikes violently. A scream erupts somewhere close to the microphone, loud enough to distort the recording itself. Investigators were unable to determine whether the sound originated from one of the sisters or from something else entirely. Then everything happens at once. Rapid movement, branches snapping, heavy impacts against the ground, the microphone scraping violently across leaves and soil, and beneath it all another sound. Low, wet, breathing, close enough to overwhelm the tape completely. The final seconds deteriorate into mechanical distortion. Signal warping stretches voices unnaturally across the recording before collapsing into static. One final impact is heard. Then silence. The tape continues rolling for several more seconds after the movement stops. No voices. No footsteps. No wind. Only a low layer of empty static. And then the recording cuts out entirely. By the time search teams entered the area where the sisters were last believed to have traveled, several days had already passed. The exact timeline remains unclear due to incomplete records from the period, but available accounts suggest the initial response was limited. Rural Appalachian communities in the early 1960s often lacked the resources required for large-scale wilderness searches, especially across remote terrain with minimal access routes. At first, the assumption remained simple. The sisters had become lost. Exposure, injury, or navigational error were considered the most likely explanations. But according to later interviews with individuals connected to the search effort, that explanation began weakening almost immediately. The forest itself appeared wrong. Not visually, not in any way that could be formally documented, but multiple accounts describe the same overwhelming impression upon entering the search area. Stillness. No wildlife movement. No birds. No ambient forest noise beyond occasional wind moving through the trees. One volunteer later described the silence as pressing. Another stated that even experienced hunters refused to move too deeply into certain sections after dark. No official reports mention these statements directly, but they persisted in local retellings for years afterward. The search expanded gradually over the following days. Crews moved along known game trails, creek beds, ridgelines, and abandoned logging routes believed accessible to the sisters. Dogs were reportedly brought into the area at one stage of the operation, though surviving records conflict regarding how effective they were. Several handlers later claimed scent trails became inconsistent deeper within the forest, points disappearing entirely, then returning unexpectedly in locations already searched. Again, none of these claims were formally verified, but neither were they fully dismissed. Then came the first discovery: fragments of Clara's journal. The pages were recovered scattered across a narrow section of woodland several miles from where the sisters were believed to have originally camped. Weather damage had destroyed much of the material. Several pages were torn completely through. Others appeared partially buried beneath wet leaves and soil. No complete sequence of entries survived. Only fragments, observations, warnings, descriptions of movement between the trees, and repeated references to something following them. Investigators initially believed the journal pages had simply been dispersed by weather conditions or animal activity. But one detail complicated that explanation. Many of the pages were found clustered unnaturally close together despite severe environmental exposure, as though they had not scattered naturally over time, but had been left, placed. The second discovery proved even stranger. The recording device, recovered partially buried beneath layers of mud and leaves near a shallow depression in the terrain. According to archived notes connected to the investigation, the recorder showed signs of physical damage consistent with heavy impact. Portions of the outer casing had fractured inward. Moisture had entered the tape compartment. Dirt and plant matter were embedded deep within the mechanism itself. Yet somehow the tape inside remained partially intact. Enough to preserve the final recording. Enough to preserve the voices. Enough to preserve whatever had happened during those final moments in the forest. Then came the discovery that shifted the tone of the entire investigation permanently. The remains of the sisters' final campsite, or what was left of it. Searchers described severe disarray throughout the area. Equipment scattered irregularly. Supplies overturned. Personal belongings recovered far beyond what investigators considered normal dispersal range. But perhaps most unsettling, there were signs the camp had been abandoned suddenly. Not packed. Not dismantled. Left. One report references damage to nearby trees consistent with forceful impact, though the source was never identified conclusively. Another notes unusual markings in the surrounding soil that investigators were unable to classify with certainty due to weather degradation. No definitive animal tracks were recovered. No clear evidence of human interference. Only fragments, disruption, and absence. Because despite the scale of the search effort, one thing was never found: the sisters themselves. No remains. No confirmed clothing recovery beyond isolated fabric fragments. No evidence clearly indicating whether Clara and Mabel died in those woods, or vanished deeper into them. Officially, the case eventually faded into the category of unresolved wilderness disappearances, a classification shared by numerous missing persons cases across remote sections of North America, where terrain, weather, and time erase evidence faster than investigators can recover it. And perhaps under ordinary circumstances, this case would have disappeared the same way. Forgotten. reduced to a brief newspaper mention and scattered local memory. But the recording remained. The journal remained. And over time, so did the stories. Stories pass quietly between communities near the Appalachian forests. Stories warning against following unfamiliar voices at night, against leaving marked trails, against responding when something calls your name from beyond the trees. Because in regions shaped by isolation and wilderness, legends rarely survive for generations without attaching themselves to something real. Not always a creature, not always an event, sometimes only a feeling, a pattern, a fear repeated often enough that people stop questioning why it exists. Even now, portions of the Appalachian wilderness remain largely untouched by modern development. Vast sections of forest continue stretching for miles without interruption. And despite advances in mapping, communication, and search technology, disappearances still occur there. Most are explainable. Some are not. And among the stories that continue circulating through those mountains, one idea appears repeatedly. The forest does not always let people leave. Some say the forest doesn't take you, keeps you. And according to local accounts collected decades after the disappearance of Clara and Mabel, there are still moments, deep within isolated sections of the woods, when hikers report hearing voices where no one should be. Faint, distant, calling softly between the trees, sometimes crying, sometimes whispering for help, and sometimes sounding almost close enough to follow. Help me equals